how do you describe the current housing challenge?
Well, it's often referred to as a crisis, and we know what the crisis is. It's the number of houses that we're building every year. We're sort of around about the 100,000 mark, and we should be double that. But for me, the crisis is much about the architectural quality of the houses we are building as well. There's a fantastic image in the Fringe brochure of underneath this. Could you pass me that brochure there? I just want to show what I mean. If you go to the page where this is advertised, this talk, which I'm not sure where it is, it looks like a sort of green, there we are, a greenfield sort of development here with a series of detached houses all clumped together. Now, there's about a metre space between these developments. Essentially, this is a terrace. You know, this building, this development here wants to be a typical street, a terraced street. But there is this kind of notion that we all must have our own gardens in exactly the same spot and patch that we want, etc. And that is still kind of dominating the house building kind of agenda. Very kind of, you know, early 20th century ideas about what the home is. So I think contemporary thinking about architectural ideas, the kind of ways we want to live, hasn't really fully filtered into the kind
of... So
of...
as much about what you're actually building as,
absolutely.
As the missing bits of it. Peter, what do you think? From your perspective at the heart of London and TfL, how do you describe the current housing challenge?
A lot of my answers are going to be very centred on London. But for me, the housing crisis is affordability. You get a lot of development, a lot of development activity and excitement in high-value areas of London and indeed high-value areas of the UK. You get less activity and excitement in lower areas. It's not rocket science. But you look at East London, you look at South East London, there are a lot of areas of opportunity to bring forward fairly significant numbers of housing there. And I think we really need to start making that a more attractive place for development to take place.
Simon, what about you? Same question. I mean, do you describe the challenge? Is it a crisis? Is it a challenge around affordability? Is it a challenge around, as Rory says, building the right stuff?
Well, you know, I think that the word crisis is really interesting, isn't it? Because there isn't really a crisis in the life or death sense of the word, right? I think what you've got is a kind of economic spectrum of market, of supply and demand, right? Which is taking place right across the city. I mean, the actual only crisis is that if you're out looking for somewhere to live in London, 2/3 of the flats you're going to see are bodge jobs done by cowboy builders, right? And that's very, very difficult. I think there's a lot of low-cost areas around London. And the challenge, like for example, Tottenham, Wembley, some of the suburbs, you know, places like Lambeth, and the challenge is how do we make those places more attractive and make those places better places for people to live?
So, John, I mean, how do you see this is an opportunity then, is it? I mean, from your perspective with what you're doing at BRE, is this an opportunity rather than a crisis?
You've taken the words out of my mouth there. This is an opportunity, a fantastic opportunity to improve the quality of the delivery, eliminate that performance gap that we're struggling to get over in the industry, but also make homes a healthier place for people. And if you can get the homes right and the comfort right, then we're helping out our colleagues in the health service and making sure that we're not just passing on the cost of poor housing to the NHS. So this is one of the biggest opportunities to seize if we're going to build this 2 million houses we require.
And Robin, I suppose, given what you were saying earlier, are we not thinking about this problem in the right way? I mean, you mentioned the fact that, you know, we are focused around trying to make the actual buildings cheaper, when reality is, at the heart of the problem for you remains this issue of land ownership.
Yeah, yes, to me it does. It's a question to me, it's a fundamental question to me of how we choose to use the land that we have available. And we have the land available. As you've been saying, it may not be in terribly desirable places, but then that's been the history of development right across the whole of the country, that gradually places that weren't particularly desirable become desirable. So yes, at the heart of it is the way in which we use the land. And if we can address the land issue, because we talk about supply and demand, but one of the massive fallacies of the 20th century in terms of housing is that we have a market. You don't have any kind of a market anywhere if you artificially restrict the fundamental element of supply in the market, which is precisely what we're doing with housing. So that the opportunity I see for us developing this is that if you can take in some way the land cost element out, which is what I'm proposing by using public land, you give architects, developers and builders, and particularly architects, a huge amount more space in which to build decent, quality, affordable, sustainable buildings which you can deliver at a price which people can afford to buy.
Rory, is that a solution that you think we could see work? I mean, is that the kind of innovative thinking which we need to embrace?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's, you know, there's a number of sort of approaches that are just sort of wrong at the moment. The kind of very sort of media-friendly, headline-grabbing approach of, you know, sink estates regeneration that has been announced in the last couple of weeks. First of all, that is a disgraceful term to talk about people's housing. It's an outdated term. It is just wrong. So they're starting off on the wrong foot. And they talk about £2 billion or so being available to do this. That sounds like it might make a difference, but if you look at the numbers closely, and there was a great article in Building last week, and being an ex-Architects Journal, I never really want to promote building, but I'm not with the AJ anymore, so I can say this. A very good magazine and some very good insight there. Have a look at their article about regeneration. But the point they make is there's only £140 million left from that pot. So my sort of fear here is it's not really being taken seriously. And one of the big things we have to do is actually look at existing stock. Not all sink estates, if that's what we're going to call them, are actually ready to be torn down. We need to think about what do we do with the people who live there? Where do they go when they're decanted, while they're upgraded or knocked down? There's just the quality of debate at high level at the moment is PR level. It's not getting involved in detail about real innovation, how we're going to tackle this. This should be a challenge to define us as a nation, you know? Like rehousing the society in the 21st century. This should be something that the brightest minds, the biggest talents in the whole country are flocking to do, not develop a rival app to Uber. Do you know what I mean?
John, do you agree with Rory saying around, you know, the part of the challenge is not just around, you know, building new, it's about actually making sure we're doing the right things with our existing stock?
The 26 million homes, they're not going to go anywhere. We've got to do something. We've got to refurbish them. We've had a full start on that through the Green Deal and those measures. So we've got a chance to revisit that, get it right, but also do that weird thing of trying to integrate new homes with the existing stock, see how they can complement, how they can enhance communities as well. I was in Birmingham a couple of weeks ago for the City Summit, and there's fantastic opportunities there to make Birmingham a better place, and they've got a growing population, so we don't want to be too London-centric on this. There's other growing cities in the UK.
Simon, what do you think? I mean, do you think we are thinking as built environment professionals? Are we thinking big enough? Are we thinking about the right solutions? Are we thinking too much about the construction techniques, the off-site fabrication cleverness, rather than the issues such as what do we do about our existing stock? How do we actually make the land more available?
Well, I think land availability is the key issue. And I think that works on a small scale and on a large scale. So, I mean, if you and talking about desirability and supply and demand, if you compare neighbourhoods across a desirable neighbourhood in London like Primrose Hill, on a small scale, all of the lofts and the attics above the shops on Primrose Hill are taken up and converted to rental or for sale apartments. But if you go to Green Lanes along Tottenham, that's where you still get lots of empty space above shops. You've got lots of disused buildings, all of that stuff not being used properly. On a large scale, in places like Tottenham, you still have what you might call kind of scruffy industrial estates, right? Which are maybe kind of bringing the tone of some of those neighbourhoods down. And I think there's opportunities for the developers to, and particularly for the planners, to have a look at the land pattern, land usage around those town centres, like Wembley, Tottenham, those kind of places. And in particular, I think employment use actually is the big issue for the future. I mean, could planning authorities look at redistribution of their employment uses in their town centres to allow more land availability?
Peter, we heard Isabel talking earlier about the I suppose, the link and the growing link, the increasing link between transport development and housing, and trying to join up all those different silos. I mean, that's still for you. Are we making progress? Is that a potential solution to actually try to join up and make housing more deliverable by bringing in transport infrastructure?
Well, hopefully, because that's what my job is. But fundamentally, TfL has a lot of land holdings. We've got 5,700 acres of land within M25. We are part of the Merrill family. We have a lot of different bosses, mind you, Isabel being one of them, so I can't exactly stray too far from what she said. However, we have...
She's leaving.
Yeah, she is. There's only got 8 weeks left or something
Say
like
whatever
that.
you want. Don't worry.
So we have an obligation to deliver operational improvement to Transport for London, make the trains, the buses work better. We have an obligation to deliver housing for London because there's a mass need for it within Greater London. We have a financial requirement to drive money back to public coffers, particularly as George Osborne is not exactly throwing money at people nowadays. And we have an obligation to make place, to make those areas that we're actually looking to develop on TfL's network better places. But all of those are actually underpinned by the fourth. If you make a better place, you drive more rental value. So that actually then feeds into producing more value. If you make a better place, you have a better interaction between buses and trains. If you make a better place, you might be able to convince the planners to build more density, which then produces more homes, but also produces more value. And all of that is then able to be spun back around, reinvested into London to bring forward operational improvements like step-free access, like new stations, like Bakerloo Line Extension or Northern Line Extension. This is inherently linked. You can't separate these things anymore because the money just isn't there.
So for you, the public sector really taking the lead in providing the framework for the private sector to come in, is that the model?
The model we are taking is TfL is becoming, let's say, a master developer. We're looking to set the feasibility, to gain planning permissions in some instances, undertake design work, but not only on TfL's land. It needs to be wider than that. We have maybe land holdings in particular areas of town that could be levered against to produce much more housing numbers if we jump into bed with neighbouring landowners, neighbouring developers, neighbouring estates such as maybe the NHS or Network Rail.
Robin, what would your advice be to Peter in terms of the way that he's using his land bank?
Well, I mean, I come from a long way away from TfL, but since the element of the whole of this is much to do with how you use the land that you've got available, then it may be that if you wish to deliver housing, that you consider the idea of banging in the land. I tell you an interesting example in one area where we were looking precisely at this, that negotiating with a developer over the development of land in which you want to include a large percentage of affordability very often means that you get very little value for the land that you're disposing of. Absolutely. If, for example, you decided on a site that you were going to sell, that you were going to hang on to the freehold of a quarter of it, to put it in as delivering affordable housing and hanging on to the freehold, and not pose any imposition on the developer for any affordability at all, you'll find he'll give you money. So that actually it has a double bonus. So I'm not in a position to advise Peter.
Peter,
I mean, I come from 150 miles
Peter,
away.
what's your thoughts on what?
The issue of affordability is a very interesting one. You have affordability with a capital A, affordable housing that you go and within 10 years within developers, they bring forward, I don't know, let's say 35% affordable housing. And that's social rent or it's intermediate use. If you take affordability with a lowercase a, and then you look at, okay, how much does a house cost per square foot in Barking and Dagenham? Well, that might be £320 a square foot, as opposed to Mayfair, which is £3,300 a square foot. The difference of affordability between those two different areas is massive. Mm-hmm. You then have many areas in between. So Morden, for example, 550, Harrow, 650. You've got areas of London that actually are within affordability criteria for London. Now, I don't believe that the answer to the affordability issue, and I think the housing crisis is an affordability problem, But it isn't only about affordable housing with a capital A. It's about TfL, other landowners in the public sector, NHS, Network Rail, the Ministry of Defence, bringing their land forward, partnering with the private sector, because we don't have the resources to be able to deliver this to the market ultimately, but then actually focusing upon areas that Londoners do actually have the ability to go and afford.
Roy, what's your take on this issue of affordability and making it? Well, is a solution to making houses more affordable just simply around taking, doing something around the land value, or is it about having a major program of publicly built?
Well, I've got to be honest, I just don't really have any expertise in that to offer any serious advice. But what I would say is that Britain is sort of by far and away in Europe the country that's linked sort of financial instrumentation to the built environment so solidly, and the increase in house prices in the UK far outstrip anywhere else in the rest of Europe. And that's not just in London, in other parts of Britain too. And there's just such an obsession with home owning here, as if it sort of defines you as a citizen. The government also is obsessed with this, with these right-to-buy programs now on the Housing Association. They've been included into the right-to-buy strategy, which is at odds, actually, with their desire to upgrade housing estates as well. Because if you upgrade housing estates of housing association properties and council properties, those people will then have a higher value property to sell, and they'll come out of the market. They'll come out of the rental market. So it's, nothing is working because of this obsession of home ownership. We need to sort of consider all sorts of different models in order to kind of build a more equitable society that people can, find the right home for them.
So Simon, do you see this? I mean, the question I kicked off with is this a public sector challenge, or is it a private sector opportunity? I mean, where should the lead be coming from to make this bridge this affordability gap, or bridge this the gap of not having enough houses?
Well, in some of the programs that we're involved with, we're working in Hammersmith at the moment on a program of estate regeneration with the local council there, who are building the first generation of council housing, if you like, for 20 or 30 years. And actually the model there is not all for sale. I mean, it's a complete range of PRS, affordable rented, all sorts of different models, using gap sites, looking at all sorts of different ways of increasing the density. And I think the key challenge there is about amenity space and making sure housing standards are kept to, all of that kind of thing. So I think that kind of estate regeneration that's led by local councils is very vital. The other program that we're involved with at the moment is town centre regeneration. We're working with Redbridge Council, and that's very interesting. It's around the Crossrail and the bringing of Crossrail to Ilford Town Centre, and it's looking at the council-owned and the redundant office and stock that's and commercial land that's right in the city centre around the new Crossrail station, and how can we convert that to housing? So I think all of those land issues are being unlocked by public sector.
Because John, I mean, one of the things that Isabel did also make very clear in her mind that for the private sector, they do whatever they do because of market forces. They are very happy with the current situation. Are they the problem? Or is that just the way that we're structurally set up?
Yeah, we know there's 500,000 approved planning applications out there, so there is homes in the pipeline, but they seem to be being drip-fed through. So that is always going to cause a problem. I live in one of those unfashionable areas that's suddenly going to have Crossrail 2 dot New Southgate suddenly appear. Now this is an opportunity to ring-fence land along the Crossrail 2 and say this can be affordable housing, this is going to be the people who service our city, and rather than what will probably happen is the property sections of the press will say buy now and prices will rocket in this area. So this is a chance to build quality, affordable, key worker, proper long-term rental, homes where people will settle down, be part of the community, and then service London and have jobs. So,
Robin?
Yeah, I I think this was a long time coming. I agree with Rory. I'm not obsessed with the idea of home ownership, but what I am saying is this, that rather like Isabel said about cars, and the reason she was a Luddite about driverless cars was that people want to be in their own cars and they want to go where they want when they want to. And I think people are very much like that about houses. Now, can I give you a very quick trot through? In 1980, I was a city councillor in Bristol. Bristol had then a population of just over 400,000, 150,000 dwellings, of which 47,000 were council. So nearly 1 in 3 Bristolians lived in a council house.
Yeah, as recently as 1980.
Yeah, in 1980. Yeah. The 1980 Housing Act, which allowed the sale of council houses, actually wasn't a totally daft idea, because our relet rate of those 47,000 houses was 1.5%. In other words, 98.5% of our tenants in Bristol stayed put. So since half of them had long since paid for their houses in rent, you might just as well sell them to them. The problem was quite fundamental in that we weren't then allowed to use the capital receipts to build new houses. The result was that 10 years later, when I retired from the council in 91, instead of having a waiting list of 2,000, we had a waiting list of 8,000. We'd lost 1/3 of our housing stock, and we'd built a grand total of 27 houses. And this wasn't 5 minutes ago, this was a quarter of a century ago. And this is the seat of the problem that we have. So, I want to restore affordability to the house owners who wanted to buy back then and could, because by letting them spend their own money, mortgaging themselves to the hilt with their own money, you create the space underneath to provide for the social housing element that there is always going to be.
Simon, do you see that? I mean, you're nodding. You agree? You see that as a problem? What kind of policy shifts do you think we should be looking at the government right now to be making?
Well, a little anecdote is one of the key challenges is, I think, at the moment, is how to reuse industrial land, because I think if you go back 10, 12 years ago when Richard Rogers produced the Urban Renaissance report, right, there was a lot of large pieces of industrial land all across London and the southeast. Nearly all of those have gone now. And so now the challenge is to look at the existing or used industrial or commercial land and how can we reappraise that maybe for housing. And the key challenge there is trying to convince local authorities that actually that land can be suitable for housing, and also that you can create housing in what was maybe a previous industrial zone where they just seen whether it's retail sheds or it's some kind of warehousing in an ethical way, so that you're actually creating a nice place a decent quality of place to people to live. And I think for us as designers, that's one of the most interesting challenges, is how to make good housing estates out of these kind of industrial places.
Peter, what do you think, from your perspective where you're on TFO, I mean, what do you see as the major drivers that might prompt some changes in policy, some changes in policy which will prompt more affordable housing?
Or affordable housing. I think the political demand is already there. All of the four mayoral candidates have put housing right at the top of their agendas. I think it's there. I think it will be a case that you'll hear a lot of rhetoric, and it may not be any more than that within the candidacy coming forward, to say we'll build 50,000 homes a year. Whether they achieve it or not, I think it'll be absolutely fascinating to see. But Boris said so, Ken said so. We'll try and contribute towards that. The changes in policy, it's a very difficult one to try and answer, really. Looking at industrial land is one element. Barking Riverside is just under redevelopment now to produce 14,000 homes. But where does that industry go? Do we look at actually changing the London plan to say, well, okay, instead of do we go back to zoning, or is industry changing? How do we want to bring about homes? How do we want to bring about that work-life balance? Is working from home more of an issue that we can start to support? Is the local train station a community hub, or is it also a commercial hub? We need to start looking at these issues and opportunities as a broad spectrum, not just in isolation.
I want to get some questions from the audience. I mean, just while you're thinking about your questions, can I just say to John, from your perspective at the BRE, I mean, do you think that there are some new radical thinking that we ought to be really embracing? So maybe stuff which is going on at BRE, some radical thinking about new ways to redevelop, new ways to remodel, new ways to actually put our existing housing stock to greater and better use?
I think we do need to look at repurposing some buildings. They're not always fit for purpose. We may have to, in the same way a lot of councils are looking where they've got lots of, like they've got 20 buildings trying to deliver public services, and somewhere like Brent where they've created one excellent new building and then they've freed up 20 old buildings that can then be used, turn into housing and the like. But mostly it's about saying, how do we make the quality of life, the comfort for those people who can live in the house? We've been building boxes and forgetting to actually build it around the person. So our focus, it might not be fundamentally different, but it's actually going back and looking at the quality of life for the person in that unit, whether they're vulnerable, young, very old, mixed tenure, making sure that the community exists and people have health and wealth. They've got healthy buildings and they've got money in their pocket.
I mean, Rory, we heard yesterday from NLA, there were some presentations about some interesting, some radical solutions, and whether it is solutions around building in people's back gardens or other solutions to create different style homes. I mean, are there radical solutions that you can think of?
I find all of these kind of sort of skirting around the edges ideas a bit ridiculous. About the goldsmith the other day was saying that we should sort of build above shops and bring it up to kind of surrounding roof heights and stuff. Yeah, but I mean, that's just not going to solve the kind of bigger problem here. And sometimes innovation doesn't have to be a technological solution. It can actually just be like looking at a situation differently. And I wonder if we're a little bit obsessed with area and we should be thinking about volume. Now, I come from Glasgow where houses are actually generally a bit bigger. And when I first moved to London and got a terraced house in Peckham, I was kind of shocked at the size of the living room. I managed to get the TV in. Luckily, they became flat screen and space started to kind of blossom again. But if we start thinking about volume and how we occupy volume, we can get away from the idea of room numbers, floor area, because you don't exist in 2 dimensions. You exist in 3 dimensions. So I'm a little bit nervous to say, let's abandon the space standards that have been set out, but they kind of aren't being adhered to anyway. So if we could start to see innovation in thinking about the volume of space and how we use that.
So maybe we're thinking about the wrong kind of designs then?
Yeah, to a certain extent. And innovation doesn't always have to be a technological solution.
Questions? Who's got some questions they want to put to the panel? Yeah. I'll come down here first, then I'll go there.
Jeff Beacon, the Pollution Tax Association. Quite shocked at the 3 eco-towns I've looked at where carbon footprints are quite enormous compared with what they should be. But I'm so despairing of the planning system, which takes from the poor to give to the rich and from the young to give to the old, that I think we ought to look at plot land planning again. I grew up on a plot land house, and I think we should outline 1 million plots and let individuals have the planning permission, because remember, that is what's worth the money. Planning permission goes for about 100k a house, and it's worth the land is worth almost nothing without it.
Robin? I imagine, Robin, you'd agree?
Yeah, I would agree. In fact, there are 2 things. I'd pick up John's point about the half million houses in the pipeline, which would be a significant contribution, and there I'd use carrot and stick. Provided the carrot is a very large one and very heavy and doesn't break when you hit people with it. In terms of planning and individual houses, I would set up planning-free zones. I would have almost the same as Almere in Holland, where in Holland, who has to make its own land, you can still buy a plot for 25 grand within 30 miles of the centre of Amsterdam and put up more or less what you like.
25 grand? Surely it
Yep.
costs 1,000.
Yeah, we could make it free. We could make it free. And I would absolutely agree with setting up land areas where individuals were able to put up their own house.
Peter, could you see that working in London?
Yes. Sorry. all you
Peter,
I can see working outside of dense locations, but I think when we're getting towards where transport hubs need to be, I think the sum of the total will be greater than the individual parts.
can I get a view from John on the result of some of the eco towns we're seeing? I mean, are we going down the wrong path there with some of the eco town designs?
We've done, we've met the housing challenge before, post-war. We built it, we built garden cities. I can see why they revisit them, but again, if you don't create the infrastructure to support them, you're just putting people in cars and they're going to drive everywhere. So they have to be built. Ebbsfleet lends itself with its high-speed link, but otherwise, don't just drop them anywhere.
Rory, what do you think about eco towns?
Well, I mean, are there any? There was Brown's eco-towns that never materialised because they were put in places that didn't have any existing infrastructure and there was no economic infrastructure around there. So, I don't know, I'm not even sure it is Hannam Hall. Yeah.
Footprints of 14 tonnes a person,
Yeah.
which is about 5 times what it should be.
Yeah.
The same is true. I bet the same is true of Northwest Bicester, and of course Bedsed had enormous embodied carbon. Well, probably less than the average, but still enormous compared to the remaining carbon footprint before we screwed the climate up.
Yeah, I mean, I think we did a lot better post-war with, a very kind of state-led intervention about the creation of new towns. I think they have been a success. Milton Keynes is the fastest-growing city in Europe. It's being densified at its core, I believe. I believe that's the case. So I think you have to have government intervention here as well as private sector. They have to work together. We need a plan,
Another question.
Yeah, it's kind of following on from that, really. In the massive push to get all these cheap houses out, it seems that carbon footprints, the push for carbon zero houses have been forgotten and just doesn't seem popular anymore. But surely it's worth putting more time and money into that now than looking really silly in the future.
I think I'm suggesting precisely that it's very important that if you take away the land cost from the element of building the house, you can actually afford to invest quite a lot of money in precisely those things and still deliver it as affordable. In other words, the reason for taking the land price out is to give the scope to this responsible development that in the future we're going to have to do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting looking at an event like this where you're surrounded by kind of ecological building products. It's any responsible kind of architect or design firm is now working with these kind of products to create, if not zero carbon housing, very kind of low carbon housing, and that is underpinned by the really good work that John's team do at the BRE with the new HQI indicators that we're working with these guys on that, and all of the kind of local codes and regulations. And I think the issue with all of these kind of products around us is that for developers is that there's always going to be a cost attached to them, right? And so there's always a cost in terms of implementing them in your homes, and that's an issue that changes over time as the products become better. Generally, though, I think for me the challenge is, and that is what we're doing all this, I think as a general rule, as designers, as best we can, and reasonably successfully with new developments. The challenge is how do we make sustainable communities, right, and how do we create economic sustainability for society generally, and better quality of space.
Peter, how high is it on your radar at TfL? You're looking to solve a housing crisis, but are you really looking to solve it with any means possible, or are eco homes on your radar?
Sustainability is very high within TfL's agenda. Even if you look at just outside of housing, if you look at the transport network, we effectively run on electricity. That is the lifeblood of TfL. If we could bring forward, let's say 30% renewable units, 30% renewable targets within all of our housing schemes, those housing schemes might become batteries to run our train set. That's something that we are seriously considering taking forward. Using the heat from the underground network to actually go and heat the homes, or indeed heat the water that people use within the homes, because heating is no longer really that much of an issue any longer. We are looking at this on a very wide basis, but maybe the electricity we produce can go to contribute towards, let's say, Zach's cars or Dean Sadiq's cars, if I'm not trying to be politically biased. It might be a car club around London, therefore actually getting people off of driving their own cars into driving TfL cars, just like Boris bikes are. They may run on TfL's electricity juice. All of this is trying to be solved in a much broader, wider context. But fundamentally, in terms of our individual planning, we are looking to rely and satisfy policy just like the rest of the industry.
Yeah, couple of questions. Got one over here, one here.
My understanding is that the planning profession and social housing came out of discussions and debates around public health, and that seems to be coming back. And what would it mean in real terms to really embed public health within housing design and regeneration?
John.
Yeah, we've done a lot of study in this area. We know that if we eliminated all the Category 1 hazards, trips, falls, excess cold, we'd save the NHS about £900 million a year. They could do with the money. So if we can just make sure that everyone is building the best they can to eliminate that, and then addressing all the existing problems we have. So that's a no-brainer.
Simon, anything to add?
Well, health and safety is a kind of key issue in everything we do in the construction industry. And I think what's really interesting is the studies being done at the moment that link the kind of health and safety of environments, right, in terms of crime reduction, right, for example, violent crime, whether it's prostitution, mugging, drugs, anything like that, with the design of housing estates and layouts. And I think we're actually recognising that. I mean, thankfully, finally, after kind of maybe 20 years or so of neglect, and how you design an estate in terms of security, observation, surveillance, good quality of amenity space, good spatial standards, creating communities like you were saying earlier about libraries, for example, and good community villages, absolutely all essential.
Can I just add to that? I think you need to be a little bit careful about, trying to find solutions to health through the construction industry sometimes. I mean, I do applaud, CABE made a suggestion that staircases, there's about 2005 staircases should be more visible in public buildings to encourage people to use them. I think that was actually quite a good thing. One of the reasons being staircases can be quite nice architectural elements and quite inviting as well, and give the architect a chance to kind of flourish a little bit. But I don't really want to live in this society that's overly prescriptive like that. I mean, the most sought after house in London is a kind of terraced, two-storey house that's not very well built, that has all sorts of trip hazards and difficulties in Stoke Newington, a kind of 1900 built house. We're not sort of going back and kind of smoothing out all the rough edges there. And I just think it's a little bit, yes, we should be obviously trying to build a healthier society, but let's not invest too much kind of evangelical kind of.
Can I imagine that from Peter, from your perspective, a healthy place to live is one which hasn't got lots and lots of diesel buses going by outside it?
I agree. I mean,
that's more like it. Yeah.
Diesel buses are something that obviously has been on the hit list for a long time. By 2020, the vast majority of our services, particularly in central London, will be electric only, single deckers. The double deckers will be hybrids. But just going back to your point in terms of health, let me answer it not just from an individual housing design point, but from a community or a societal point. That we're taking very seriously the prospect that next to the train station there might be a health centre, there might be an assisted living unit, there might be a dentist, there might be an ophthalmologist. Because actually the role of the train station we think is likely to change significantly coming forward. It won't take away the actual functionality of getting on a train and going into central London unless teleportation happens anytime soon. But if that can become the centre of a community, that actually you need your teeth doing, right, okay, I'm going to go down to the train station. Or you need your eyes, your hearing tested, or whatever, you can go down to the train station, because that actually becomes the centre of your community.
Question here.
Arguably, a central dimension of the housing crisis is not just the lack of affordable housing, but the way that the development has occurred and is occurring. And what I'm talking about is the kind of rampant development that pushes out communities and existing diversity that lends the sort of rich fabric to the neighborhood. I hear this over and over. So is there new thinking about structures in which communities can have a voice in the face of this kind of top-down development?
Rory, do you want to kick that one off? You spoke about that earlier.
I mean, I think it's just really important that that's addressed. I don't think it's necessarily going to solve, you know, the delivery of 200,000 homes a year, but I think co-housing, self-build, custom build, these all have to be sort of made more available and easier to kind of participate in, to, you know, give communities a chance to develop the kind of places that they want to live. And the other thing is, you know, in general, the construction industry and the people who make decisions about housing are like us. You've got a panel here of, you know, 5 blokes, probably from similar backgrounds, and we do need a more diverse kind of approach to the built environment, and we will have a kind of richer, more suitable environment as a result. But, you know, getting back to the basics, these different models have to become part of the mix. At the moment, the delivery systems are so sort of monolithic that we're just not getting what's actually needed.
Can I
Peter, yeah.
I really want to give you a very short story. It's true, but up in Northwood, we ran a bit of an experiment, a social experiment, if you will, but it was one that was very successful. In May 2013, we signed a development agreement with a retail developer who will remain nameless, although they begin with B. And they had plans to put a 50,000 square feet Sainsbury's in place and had no and very little community engagement. We had objections, 9,000 signatures on a petition that was sent to all and sundry. TfL was just going through its new business plan at that point in time, and we held our hands up and said, I'm sorry, we've done this very unilaterally. We scrapped that contract, and we came back and we ran a community engagement process for about 18 months. That we then said, right, okay, we hear what you don't want, now tell us what you do want. And if it's viable, we'll build it. So we put all of our land into this exercise and ran an 18-month engagement exercise where the community came up with the ideas. We gave them a design team, but they were guided by the community. This has been unprecedented as far as I'm aware. It certainly has been nowhere near TfL's agenda previously. But the scheme that has come out of that exercise is more valuable than the scheme that was going to be delivered by the retailer, by the retail development partner. So it's been successful in a number of different instances, but also coming back to the 4 points, it makes a place which has actually increased values for the development coming forward. But it actually, as part of that, it's got step reactors and a new station. It wins on many, many different angles, not just finance for TfL.
So do you, apologies, but there's some kind of big party going on next door. I mean, I'll have a word, it's the engineers. Simon, do you think that people like Peter should be more controlling, I suppose, around, you've got the Northern Line extension, which has precipitated the Battersea Park development, which I imagine that is the kind of community that you are talking about. Should there be more controls over what comes about?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think one of the biggest issues I worry about is the density that London is getting at the moment, and what impact that will have on the city. And I think levels of amenity, levels of quality are really important to maintain. I think we're quite lucky in London that we have the London Plan, which codifies the spatial standards for housing development and gives a lot of design code. One of the we do due diligence work on other architects' work in Manchester, for example, where there's also a lot of big development going on at the moment, and they don't have those kind of codes and controls of design, spatial control, and we see developments coming forward for us to critique, which have a lot of the design problems from the 70s, long internal kind of corridors, poor kind of amenity spaces, which we like to think that we've kind of come over a hurdle from, and actually it's still going on, where the developer is just allowed to do whatever they want. So I think it's an ethical issue, and I think it's an ethical issue for the design community to really tackle. It's very important.
Thank you. It's a good question. Any more points people want to raise from the floor? Yeah, I've rushed around that. But while I'm going over, I mean, do you think, John, do you think that the built environment professionals have the skills and the vision, I suppose, to get over that kind of problem and to drive, I suppose, the kind of ideas that people like Robin are trying to put forward?
I think there's a lot. We deal with a lot of experts every day. There's a lot of skill. We're hugely resourceful. We manage to squeeze houses in wherever we can. we manage to keep them at an affordable cost. Whether they're sold at an affordable rate or rented out at that is another question. But what we also want to do is make sure that we are creating that community, as everyone sort of mentioned communities today as being critical to London. Getting the right social mix, getting the ability to have Londoners service Londoners rather than people from the home counties having to come all the way in.
Hello. I've got a bit of a concern about the relationship between affordability and financial viability in development. Peter mentioned on some of these infrastructure projects realising value in the increase in rent prices. But we're in a situation at the moment in London where house values are roughly sort of 15 times average incomes. Average income in Haringey, where I work, is about 30,000 for a household. Is it really viable to expect house prices and rental prices to keep on going up in order to fund and support new development and investment? And yeah, I also want to pick up on a point that I think Simon made right at the beginning, because I work in Tottenham as well. And we do notice that thing about realising relationship between economic development, space for economic development, and also housing. And I think the huge pressure at the moment on housing in London is making it quite complicated to balance out some of that relationship. And I mean, Isabel mentioned earlier about working in silos, so it's something that we're tackling and reducing that. So yeah, generally the thoughts on financial viability, affordability, and the relationship between economic development, wages, income, so on, and house prices.
Simon, I think you better take that one.
Well, you know, you're right, absolutely. But I think the issue is, you know, if you take a really good neighbourhood of London where the house prices are high, like Crouch End, right, in Haringey, okay, it's a lovely place to live, and that's why the house prices are really nice. If you go to the opposite end of Tottenham, it's a lot scruffier, there's a lot more crime, right? The town centre isn't in as good a condition. It's got a whole list of issues which Crouch End doesn't have. And that's what's driving the house price difference, right? It's not that there aren't cheap places. The other thing is, you know, it's not that there aren't cheap zones in London you can live. I mean, it is cheaper to live in Tottenham or Lambeth, or there's places in Southwark, right, than it is to live in Crouch End or Primrose Hill or a place like that. But the issue is it's not desirable because those places have a lot of problems attached to them. And my view is that I think, you know, well, the key issue is we should be looking at those areas with the problems, right? And how do we address them? How do we improve the quality of the environment? For example, around Tottenham Hale, right, where land prices are very low, right? And there's a lot of opportunity there potentially.
Rory, how do we break this? How do we break out the cycle of increasing house prices being needed to fund?
I mean, again, like I just don't have the expertise to answer that. But I just want to.
You've got a point of view, Rory.
I have a point of view, but it's not gonna answer that question. And I agree with a hell of a lot what you're saying there. But I also think that young people often are kind of, you know, outliers in where they choose to live. Like Stoke Newington was not desirable 15 years ago. It's now, you know, the most desirable place in North London, or one of them. So I don't think it's the sort of worry about moving into areas which, you know, don't seem necessarily attractive. I think young people naturally go to places like that and make them into vibrant, interesting places. They just can't afford to anymore.
Absolutely.
There's not a single house under 100 grand left in London. And, you know, what do you need? You need a £35,000 salary to get a mortgage for a 100 grand property. And we're hearing that average salaries are 30k in the area where this young woman is living and working. So I don't agree with your assessment. I agree with the kind of you know, where you want to take it, but I think it's much more serious than that.
Peter, how are you tackling this?
My point, to answer your first point, say, is it sensible or indeed viable to rely upon house price inflation to pay for infrastructure? The answer to that is a very short no. Yeah. We cannot look in a crystal ball and think, actually, house prices are going to increase by 5%, even though, on average, they have done between 5 and 7% for the last 100 years. But it does that, and construction periods are obviously finite. So, no, we can't be in a position to levy infrastructure costs against future house price inflation. We are looking at utilising development over and above and around train stations to pay for operational improvement, however. But there's a flip side to that coin, and that is putting in infrastructure where it doesn't exist. And that means places like Barking Riverside, putting the Gospel Oak Line extension in to places that the houses they've got plan permission for, but they're not there yet. It's putting in the Bakerloo Line extension. And Isabel Dedry mentioned it earlier. To get that land clawback back from the existing housing stock that already exists is very difficult. SIL has tried to do it for Crossrail 1. There'll be a similar SIL exercise, I suspect, if Crossrail 2 ever gets sanctioned at the end of in the end of this financial year. But we need to get better policies and better mechanisms in place to claw back the additional value that Crossrail 2 or indeed the Bakerloo Line extension or the Northern Line extension will have upon the communities, land prices, commercial rents within those areas, and at present we don't do it. The Japanese do it fantastically, but we're not in that position.
We are bang out of time. We've been, I think we've got through quite a lot of issues, so thanks for all your questions. But I just want to finish off by just putting a final point to each of the panellists, and I'll just go down the line really. I'll start with you, Simon, as you're down the end there. I mean, who do you think, we heard earlier on about around the issues around branding and really creating brands within this this sector, brands that people trust. I suggested maybe we need to have the Apple House or whatever. I mean, who do you think is going to be driving and leading the way out of this solution? Is it the architects? Is it the engineers? Is it the manufacturers? Is it the Googles or somebody else? Who is going to be? Is it the clients? Is it the owners? Who will be leading a way out of this?
Well, I mean, ACOM, we're an integrated team at ACOM, so we are all of that. Our architects, engineers, and all of that. So I kind of have to do that plug, don't I? Really, I suppose. I don't know. It's a collaborative effort that it needs everybody in society to come together to find the solutions.
Robin, who do you think is going to be taking the initiative and leading the way? Is it maybe local communities, councillors like yourself?
No, it's got to be government. You have within this building the resources, the expertise, the imagination, the wit, and the ability to solve the problem. What you need is for government to take the initiative and have the balls to create the situation in which you can do that.
John?
I could plug the home quality mark, of course, but I think we need more. We're getting a bit more regulation around the private rental market, both on the quality and taxing their income on those. So that would lean people more to affordable renting, and maybe get rid of the right to buy for social housing. That would probably another radical measure.
Peter, what do you think? Is it going to be organisations like your own that will be leading the way out of this?
I'm not so sure it's a case of the public or indeed the private sector doing this initially. I think we've got to do this together. And I know it's a soundbite to say collaboration, but fundamentally I need the private sector to deliver what I'm doing, and the private sector need the public sector to deliver the land. So we need to do this together. I think there's a massive distrust, however, within in the wider society of developers in general. So if there's any particular brand that comes forward, I'm not so sure that's going to solve it, unless it's Savlon. You're not going to get somebody that's going to stand up and say, yes, we're the saviour, we're going to solve the day. But maybe it does. We do have to take a very community-centric approach and be as engaging and collaborative as possible with them so that they can help shape what we're doing going forward. But it has to be viable.
I'm going to give you the last word, Rory, as I came to you for the first. So, Rory, who do you see? I mean, you've been writing about this for a long, long while. Who do you see as the salvation? Who's going to be leading the way out of this problem?
Well, I agree with Robin. Taking it even further, I think it should become the defining kind of mission for Great Britain. I think this is a challenge for the whole country. It's a good way for us to kind of get whole again. We seem like a very dispersed nation these days. I actually do not see the point in being a nation state if the state doesn't actually do anything for the nation. Why are we actually organised into this country if the state is just shrinking so small and just leaving the rest of us to get on with it? But it does have to be in participation with the private sector. The private sector has to stop thinking purely about profit first. Profit will come if they take a more equitable approach. If they can give a voice to the people involved in those communities as well, they will end up making more money out of it. So we have to create that balance. But yes, it has to come from government.
Thank you very much. 2 days out of being a journalist and Rory's already got a view. Excellent. We like to see that. No, thank you very much to our panel. Thanks very much for taking part in this discussion. Thanks to Simon, to John, to Peter, to Robin and to Rory. A round of applause for our panellists, please. Thank you very much.